The very name of Madame Tussaud today recalls an international business. Wax museums carry her name in cities as diverse as Berlin, Tokyo, Amsterdam, Sydney, and Las Vegas. But of course, it's London, isn't it? The first that comes to mind. The city where she died and the city where the empire began. Today, her name is synonymous with celebrity, waxworks, sometimes a movie star or a footballer or a pop singer will reveal their own new waxwork, and you wonder which will last longer. But in earlier times, it was the worlds of politics and royalty which shaped the displays. And crucially to this story and its Dublin dimensions, it wasn't just waxworks that were on display, they're often quite morbid exhibits. Madame Tussauds life story is sometimes unclear and quite muddled, as we'll get into today. She left behind a memoir which was written in the third person. That's never good for a historian to grapple with, but it's intriguing that Dublin features in her story. She lived in Dublin, and I don't mean she lived in Dublin for a period of weeks, on and off. She was here for years. She exhibited waxworks here, some inspired by the then recent turbulent events in her native France. In France, others drawn from Irish history. And Dublin left a considerable impression on her. And later, Irish history was something that Madame Tussauds, as a broader brand, engaged with. If you went to Madame Tussauds, for example, in the 1880s in London, you would have seen the figures of Burke, Cavendish, and James Carey, all connected to the Phoenix Park assassinations, which was then a very raw political crisis and memory. Madame Tussaud died in 1850. Her son became chief artist. He would be succeeded by his son, who in turn was succeeded by, you guessed it, his own son. This was a classic family business. And John Theodore Tussaud, her great-grandson, penned the history of the family business, which was vitally important to this episode. So this today is the story of an extraordinary artist who lived in a time of different revolutions, the violence of the French Revolution, the extraordinary societal transformations of the Industrial Revolution, which, as we'll hear, was important to her success. And we'll talk about the influence of the time she spent in Dublin. That also allows us to segue nicely into the broader subject briefly of waxworks displays in Dublin, including some unfortunate figures who found themselves on a rebel barricade later on. Thanks so much for tuning into this edition. I wrote a little blog post about this a couple of years ago, but I didn't know an awful lot about this story, so it's a fair bit of reading in putting this one together. It's always nice to have the space to go off and read about something as random as Madame Tussaud in Ireland. So thank you especially to those of you who support the podcast on Patreon at patreon.com/Three Castles Burning. Now enjoy this one. I'll see you in the Wax Museum. Anna Maria Groschholz, later Marie Tussaud, was born in December 1761 in Strasbourg. That much, at least now, seems to be certain. Her family tree included several public executioners, which is a morbid employment, but as we'll hear, at times her own employment could be quite morbid. And it was a decidedly grim background and one she did a lot to conceal. Her place of birth, her family history, all of this was consistent only in being inconsistent in subsequent times. What is clear, though, in the story is the importance of Dr. Philippe Curtius in Bern, Switzerland, who employed her mother as a housekeeper and domestic employee, and who was ultimately something of a mentor to the young girl. In her memoirs, which we'll come back to many times today, he's presented as her uncle. Now, historians are unclear of that relationship, but that is how he is recalled, as her uncle. This doctor was initially drawn to wax as a means to create kind of life-sized organs useful in medical training and teaching, but in time he drifted towards commercial displays of waxworks. He was in the right place at the right time in that field. His calling was towards Paris, where he ventured in 1765. Paris was a city for him, was this city for him, I should say. One historian noting that his work satisfied public taste for historical wax figures, setting up shop in the popular entertainment districts. And in her own memoirs, again told in the third person, Madame Tussaud recalled how the art of modelling in wax was at that period in France considered a fashionable accomplishment. And Curtius' studio became one of the lions of Paris. It was, having practiced his profession for some years, that the gifted artist, finding himself in a good position, repaired to Bern for the purpose of taking back with him to Paris his sister and her children. Certainly, the wax artist was drawing real attention to himself, not only because of the strength of his work, but the quality of his conversation and hospitality. And while some felt that perhaps she was exaggerating the claims of his social circle, historical research would actually suggest that this man was moving in very intriguing circles. As Madame Tussaud remembered it, it was indeed a wonderful change to be introduced, child as she was, to all the great and noble in France. For the House of Courteous at that period was the resort of the most talented men of the day, particularly as regarded the literati and artists. Amongst those who were frequently in the habit of dining at her uncle's, Madame Tussaud specially remembered Voltaire, Rousseau, Dr. Benjamin Franklin. The city was an extraordinary melting pot of ideas. Of course, all of that was to spill over in due course. She would remember encountering figures like Tom Paine, but also her admiration for the royalty of the time. And it was a source of pride, her memoir tells us, that so much did the taste for resemblances in wax prevail during the reign of Louis that His Majesty, the Queen, and all the members of the royal family and most of the eminent characters of the day submitted to Courteous and his niece whilst they took models of them. But signs of the brewing storm were clear, and when it all came to a head, protesters made their way to the premises of Courteous, demanding wax figures to carry in an angry procession. This was July 1789, just days before the storming of the Bastille. As the historian Pamela Pilbeam writes, there was a significance to this, the mob carrying off these waxworks. Waxworks took on a new dimension in the political atmosphere of the day. There was no censorship around the display of these works, she writes, presumably because until this time no one had thought to use a wax exhibition to reflect contemporary politics. And when a showdown happens between royal troops and an angry crowd, they are carrying two waxwork figures taken from the studio. There's a lot more to that story. This is ultimately a podcast about Dublin, so let's try and get to the home turf as quickly as we can. But to pull Dublin into it here, it is worth mentioning in passing that these dramatic events in Paris had quite an electric impact at home. The storming of the Bastille was evidently something that troubled Madame Tussaud. In her memoir, chapter heads include Madness of the People and the Bastille taken by the rabble. But there could be no greater expression of support for the revolution in France in this country than participation in Bastille Day celebrations, which people here did in their thousands in 1791 and 1792. Banners thundering support for the revolution, marching bands in both Dublin and Belfast. It was evidently clear that while Edmund Burke may have been horrified by the spectacle of the French Revolution, many others embraced it. The people who marched in Dublin on Bastille Day 1791 were denounced in the pages of the press, one newspaper mocking the class of men who celebrated the event. The French Revolution may give the shop boy a pleasing opportunity of appearing in the disguise of a military officer, they scoffed. The terror was something Madame Tussaud witnessed up close. And believed to be a royal sympathiser, she walked a tightrope between life and death. Here was someone that had been around royalty. The royals had enjoyed the work of her and her uncle. And the National Geographic note that as a forced show of her loyalty to the French Revolution, she was ordered to create death masks of the guillotined aristocrats of the former monarchy. The spectacle of a king going to a guillotine was an extraordinary thing for those who witnessed it. The fate of Louis to all crowned heads, some toasted in Dublin and Belfast taverns. Two young Irish barristers, John and Henry Shears, were there. They would dip their handkerchiefs in the blood of the king. And when later hanged outside Dublin's Newgate prison, I don't think it was for nothing they were killed on the 14th of July, 1798. Bastille Day. One of the finest books I've read in recent times, and I picked it up in Connolly Books in Temple Bar, where there's still a heap of them, is called How Paris Made the Revolution and the Revolution Made Paris. And even if you're not too familiar with the streets of Paris, you end up feeling like you know the city really well by the end of the book. It vividly describes the day Marie Antoinette met her end, placing Madame Tussaud there. It's exactly 12:15 when the blade comes down, the book tells us. And of course, the executioner shows the head to the screaming crowd. Then the body is quickly transported to the cemetery, but it proves necessary to wait some time before Marie Antoinette can be buried, since the gravediggers just happened to be on their lunch break. Madame Tussaud, who would later open a museum in London that would become world famous, takes advantage of the delay to fashion a wax effigy of the dead woman's face. The guillotine, of course, horrified some people. Others sang of its glory, a contemporary radical French song heralding the permanent guillotine. In Madame Tussaud's life, the subsequent 1790s brought several important personal moments. Firstly, the death of her mentor, leaving his collection of waxworks to her. And secondly, marriage to Francois Tussaud, hence Madame Tussaud. Now, that relationship was to prove very turbulent, and in time they were pretty much completely estranged from each other. It was becoming clear to her that her future lay not in France. And with the signing of the peace treaty in 1802, temporarily pausing hostilities between the French Republic and the United Kingdom, she took the opportunity to accept an invite from the famed Paul Philidor, magician and magic lantern connoisseur, whose haunting shows in a London theatre were packing in the crowds. Philidor is an important part of this tale. I mean, he was early to the phenomenon of the magic lantern light show, or at least it going mainstream. He made his name in Paris, one historian noting his show promised ghosts and the shades of celebrated persons, but in the form of a rational expose. For people wondering what's a magic lantern, the dictionary definition, for those still lost, is an early type of projector, a machine that shines a light through a painted or photographic image on a glass sheet to produce a larger image. His travelling show had encountered opposition in many places. He was told to leave Berlin because it was irreligious. He encountered political opposition in Paris. And this was a pretty competitive industry. One historian notes that artists tried to outdo each other, adding mirrors, ventriloquism, smoke, and more besides to make a show more interesting. The magic lantern retained a certain magic for a long time, even a century later, when Irish nationalists like Maud Gonne and Alice Milligan were using magic lantern shows to evoke evictions and the horror of the Hunger Years. Maud Gonne did this with great effect during the visit of Queen Victoria to Dublin in 1900, almost a century on from Parisian and London audiences being wooed by the magic lantern. But Philip Philidor was a great success story. His ghoulish magic lantern show packed them in. And Madame Tussaud, at least initially, wasn't a great success story. She was somewhat indebted to him in London. She was the weaker end of a commercial relationship, tacked on to his offering. And as she toured extensively under his umbrella, so to speak, she grew increasingly uneasy with the relationship. Peace between Britain and France proved a very short-lived thing. And with the outbreak of the Napoleonic Wars in 1803, it was clear that returning to France was an impossibility. But the war also brought increasing anti-French sentiment in England. Anti-French ballad sheets were widespread, the cartoons of James Gilray, and Tussaud perhaps wisely embarked on something of a tour, making for Scotland and, in time, for Ireland. Madame Tussaud first arrived in Ireland in February 1804, to a country that had come through its own very recent upheaval. Remember, this was someone who'd witnessed the guillotine, but the horror. The guillotine was one thing, here it was a different morbid spectacle that had ingrained itself in the mind of the citizenry. She's in Dublin less than a year after young Robert Emmet had gone to the hangman before an enormous crowd on Thomas Street. That grotesque moment left its own lasting imprint on Dublin. A century and more later, the radical Patrick Pearse would speak of how, in the great space of Thomas Street, an immense silent crowd in front of St. Catherine's Church, a gallows upon a platform, a young man climbs to it, quiet, serene, almost smiling, they say. There is no cheer from the crowd, no groan. The man is to die for them, but no man dares to say aloud, God bless you, Robert Emmet. Dublin must one day wash out in blood that shameful memory. Well, Pearse certainly did his best there. A friend, Pearse wrote, of mine, knew an old woman who told him how the blood flowed down upon the pavement, and how sickened with horror she was as she saw the dogs of the street lap up that noble blood. Then the hangman showed the pale head to the people and announced, "This is the head of a traitor, Robert Emmet." So Dublin was perhaps not a city in the mood for gruesome things in 1804 when Madame Tussaud arrived here. And together with her son Joseph, she resided at 16 Clarendon Street, just the two of them and an extraordinary collection of waxworks. These were delicate things, and moving as they did around England, Scotland, and here to Ireland, they could get damaged on the way, so there's quite a lot of repair going on. She would display her works at what was called the Shakespeare Gallery on Exchequer Street. An advertisement ran, Shakespeare Gallery, Exchequer Street, near Grafton Street, to be seen. The most beautiful collection of figures executed from life, confusing of accurate models in composition, the figures being elegantly dressed in their proper costume, and scarcely to be distinguished from life, have been exhibited in London and Edinburgh with the greatest applause. There was massive interest in Dublin in what she was offering. And she would write to her family in France, everything is going well. When I am in Dublin, the takings can reach £100 sterling a month. People come in crowds every day from 6 o'clock until 10 o'clock. The time in Dublin was quite remarkable for a couple of reasons. One, she was now out on her own. The business relationship in London over. She was finally able to buy herself out of a partnership she no longer wanted and which felt uneven. And in Dublin, there was enormous interest in her offering, especially, the artefacts relating to the French Revolution. But she also cleverly incorporated Irish themes, and perhaps conscious that something like Robert Emmet, so recent and quite divisive, might not fit. If you visited her waxworks on Exchequer Street, you would have found Henry Grattan, the man who was spearheading the campaign for the return of an Irish Parliament to Dublin. Tussaud did not really focus her efforts on Dublin, but kind of used Dublin as a base to tour Ireland with her waxworks. But there were problems. On one occasion, on a return visit from Waterford by boat, the ship found itself in a terrible storm, damaging many of the figures. Why was she so eager to venture out of Dublin? And it would seem she identified a very lucrative market, which was the enormous garrison presence in Ireland. Soldiers in their thousands were eager for any form of entertainment. Their military superiors were seeking anything beyond drink to occupy the time and minds of young men. And things like circuses and boxing tournaments did very well, and she thought she could fit into that touring circuit. Her plan was, in her own words, to visit Limerick, Cork and Belfast, which are very good towns in which to exhibit. From there, I shall return to Scotland until we are once again at peace. She'd come here in 1804, and by 1808 and Belfast, her advertisements boasted of the strength of her waxworks, the first time she'd used the term, and she was no longer trading on the name of her mentor. Early ads often talked about Curtius, but now on her own strength. Returning to Britain, decades of touring would eventually lead her to establishing a permanent presence at Baker Street, which was an extraordinary commercial success. Baker Street means Sherlock Holmes, but it also means Madame Tussaud. And the cultural impact of what she did on Baker Street just cannot be overstated. Punch magazine told their readers in the 1840s, in these days, no one can be considered positively popular unless he is admitted into the company of Madame Tussaud's celebrities in Baker Street. The only way in which a powerful and lasting impression can be made on the public mind is through the medium of wax. You must be a doll in Baker Street before you can become the idol of the multitude. Madame Tussaud has become, in fact, the only dispenser of permanent reputation. Amongst the frequent visitors was Arthur Wellesley, the Duke of Wellington, who one historian notes insisted his favourite models were those of Queen Victoria and the dead Napoleon. Modest man, not himself. Her Chamber of Horrors was quickly infamous, gaining many mentions in the Irish press in the 1840s. But Madame Tussaud's was about much more than just waxworks. One of the key attractions in the Chamber of Horrors was a guillotine, which would later be displayed alongside waxworks of figures like the infamous Burke and Hare, Edinburgh, serial killers who sold the bodies of their victims in time. The Rogues Gallery would include figures like Dr. Crippen, Adolf Hitler, Dennis Nilsson, the Cray twins, and more. Actually, it's quite a grim experience. Though she herself died in 1850, the family business continued apace. And they were not just in the business of making waxworks. The family remained in the business of acquiring quite morbid historical artefacts. Given the obsession of the institution with all matters grim, it probably shouldn't be surprising that in the 1880s, the focus of the Madame Tussaud Museum turned to Dublin following the Phoenix Park assassinations. Previously explored on this podcast, Lord Frederick Cavendish and Thomas Henry Burke, two senior British officials, knifed to death in the Phoenix Park by the Invincibles, a sort of assassination squad within the Fenian movement. It shook the British political system to its very core. The trials were an enormous public spectacle. Famously, one Invincible, James Carey, turned informer. His evidence was vital in the sentencing of others to their deaths. And in time, Carey got his comeuppance, assassinated in turn while bound for the Cape, killed by the bricklayer and Fenian Patrick O'Donnell. But you already knew that. When Carey told on Skin the Goat, O'Donnell caught him on the boat. He wished he'd never been afloat the dirty skite.
It wasn't very sensible to tell on the Invincibles. They stuck up for the principles day and night.
Waxworks of the men assassinated in the Phoenix Park were one thing. One of Carey was something else entirely. But the museum wanted more than just these waxworks. Madame Tussaud's great-grandson recalled the story of how the museum acquired perhaps its oddest Irish artefact. This is quite long, but I think it's worth reading. The requirements of the business have often necessitated our sending fairly far afield in quest of exhibits. And this has seldom been done without success, as people with desirable relics to dispose of appear to have recognised the claim of Madame Tussauds. It had been intimidated to the management of the exhibition that there was a chance of Madame Tussauds obtaining the jaunting car in which the assassins drove to and from the scene of the crime. Michael Kavanagh was a typical Dublin jarvey with an almost unintelligible brogue, from whom the car was hired. The assassins drove several miles about the scene of the tragedy with the object of escaping detection. Our representative was forthwith sent to Dublin and soon found himself in possession of Kavanagh's car. The good-humoured jarvey seemed glad to be rid of the vehicle anyhow. The price he asked was not a prohibitive one. One thing was particularly noticeable, namely that the number on the car differed from the number quoted in the newspaper accounts describing it when taken by the police. It was discovered, however, that the Invincibles had changed the number before their fateful journey. A condition was made by Kavanagh that the pony which drew the car should also be purchased, as he wished to have done with them both. It only took a few hours to complete the transaction, he writes, and thereafter Kavanagh drove the purchaser over the ground traversed by the assassins in their endeavours to throw police off the scent. This was a voluntary act on the part of Kavanagh, and our representative was curiously exercised at the time to understand why he imagined the trip should interest him. To facilitate transit, the car was taken to pieces by a coach builder at Kingstown, Dunleary, and wrapped in sacking in the hope that it would not be observed. It was then put on the night boat for Holyhead. The pony found a home in stables belonging to the exhibition. On the voyage across, passengers whispered to each other that the Phoenix Park car was on board. And on its arrival in London, there appeared among the latest telegrams in an evening newspaper, "Kavanagh's car goes to Madame Tussaud." Evidently, the Irish correspondents had wired the news, of which we ourselves had hoped to make a special announcement. The car was soon put together and placed on view at the exhibition in one of the rooms adjacent to the Chamber of Horrors. After being exhibited for many years, the car was given to a gentleman who manifested an interest in it. Its new owner had it renovated for his own use as a private conveyance, and he might often have been seen driving it in the streets of London, no one suspecting its notorious history. Just amazing to imagine that car, the Phoenix Park, on display beside the Chamber of Horrors. Of course, the family business would continue to grow. It outgrew its initial premises, and it really has held fast as one of London's most enduring tourist attractions.
A pair of eyes, exactly like the original in colour and size, is added by first warming the eyeballs and inserting them from inside the hollow cast. Yardley has also acquired a head of hair.
An interesting sequel of sorts to Madame Tussaud's waxworks concerns Easter 1916 and the fate of number 30 Henry Street, home to what was known as the World's Fair Varieties and Waxworks. The waxworks in Dublin consisted of no Chamber of Horrors, something its founder despised the thought of in such a family environment, but it did boast waxworks of political figures and icons. It was clearly very influenced by Madame Tussauds, and a visitor to it could see Charles Stewart Parnell, Gladstone, the Duke of Wellington, Theobald Wolfe Tone, and many more. During the 1916 Rising, the Henry Street waxworks suffered greatly and eventually burnt down, But prior to its destruction, it provided some comedy relief. And one volunteer later remembered how there was a good deal of fun during the week. In close proximity to the post office in Henry Street, there was an institution called the Waxworks. I was never in it before, but I assumed it was something like Madame Tussauds in London, only on a very small scale. Access was had from one house to another by breaking holes in the walls of the houses, shops he means, so that one could walk from one end to another of the street without leaving the shelter of the houses. With the accessibility of all that the waxworks had to offer, it wasn't long till a number of our troops were arrayed in various uniforms and costumes from the wax figures. Another volunteer remembered that the figures of Wolfe Tone and King Edward were actually taken from the museum, and some genius, to quote him, put the figures at the window and immediately a fusillade of bullets came through. We had to duck for a few minutes till the firing died down. The idea of the wax figures of Wolfe Tone and King Edward being riddled with bullets amused us a great deal. Wolfe Tone was in the firing line again in 1985 when the Wax Museum at Granby Row near Parnell Square was badly vandalised by thieves with 12 wax figures destroyed. On that occasion, the sword of Theobald Wolfe Tone was taken from his hand and driven into the chest of the Margaret Thatcher waxwork. In what was formerly the Plaza Cinema, the waxworks limped on into the early 21st century before being replaced by that most lifeless but almost real-looking of Dublin icons today, a hotel. Today, the National Wax Museum Plus occupies a great location, the Lafayette building on the corner of Westmoreland Street and D'Lear Street. And it includes, fittingly enough, a chamber of horrors, though its characters include Hannibal Lecter, Freddy Krueger, and Dracula. So not the kind of morbid stuff of real-life serial killers that you might expect in Madame Tussaud. There's something quite endearing about the Wax Museum. Subjects like Pat Inglesby, Mr. Pussy, Alan Amsby, and Jack Charlton are very much local heroes, and they don't always get it right. At the time of the announcement of a wax figure of Sinead O'Connor, her brother John described it on RT's Live line as looking like, quote, a mannequin and something out of the Thunderbirds. But to their credit, the museum acknowledged the criticisms and they went again, noting that these waxworks can actually sometimes cost tens of thousands on occasion. But the unique selling point of the museum seems to be their acknowledgement and comfort with it all being a bit of crack, a bit of fun. CMAT is on the horizon, they promise. I hope you enjoyed that journey through Madame Tussauds time in Dublin and that little afterword of how the waxworks fared in 1916. Thank you so much for tuning in to this edition of the Three Castles Burning podcast.